College football as a sport has quite an interesting history, especially when it comes to who and who wasn't allowed to play the game. One author and veteran sports writer, his name is Tom Shanahan, he looked to answer questions surrounding integration within college football. Shanahan, who has been a sports writer for over 46 years, has a new book that sets the record straight on integration in the sport. It's titled The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration. And now Tom Shanahan joins me for a discussion. Tom, how's it going?
It's going great, Dexter. Thanks for having me on and for a chance to tell this story that is largely misunderstood to this day.
Yeah.
People just don't understand what happened.
Yeah, and I want to get into that so we can try to help people understand what happened. And Tom, when I came across your new book and I looked at you being a veteran sports writer, the first question that I had was about inspiration for you. So what inspired you to write The Right Thing to Do and focus on the pioneers of college football integration? What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, my first book was Ray of Light, which focused on Jimmy Ray, who was a black quarterback for Michigan State in the 1960s, 5 and 66 national championship teams. And there were no black quarterbacks back then. So I always knew that Michigan State was something different because I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in a small town called Big Rapids. And when I was a kid, that was when Michigan State was having their title seasons, and I was always a Michigan State fan. So I wrote this first book that came out 10 years ago, Ray of Light, Jimmy Ray, Duffy Daugherty, The Integration of College Football, and the Michigan State Spartans, 1965 and 1996. I began to realize later there's a much deeper story. And out of that came the story, The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration. And what I mean by that is on two levels. This is the 70th anniversary of Duffy Daugherty's first staff in 1954. And on that staff was Dan Devine, Bob Devaney, Bill Yeoman, and Sonny Grandelius. Three of those guys are in the College Football Hall of Fame. Devine went off to Arizona State, Missouri, and Notre Dame. And at all three of those places, he followed Daugherty's blueprint of ignoring the quota limitations because other schools only wanted about a half dozen black athletes. They were afraid there'd be fights in the locker room and white players wouldn't follow the black players' leadership. So they had an unwritten quota. Dan Devine followed Duffy Daugherty's blueprint. Bob Devaney went to Nebraska, won 2 national titles, 1970-71. Followed Duffy's blueprint. Bill Yeoman went to Houston, desegregated Houston's program. Sonny Grandelius went to Colorado. He's not in the College Football Hall of Fame like the other three, but he has his own incredible story about how his 1961 team stood up to Jim Crow in Miami. And then 3 other coaches related to that area are Frank Cush, who went with Devine to Arizona State and succeeded him, and then Chuck Fairbanks, who was the coach at Oklahoma when Barry Switzer was his offensive coordinator. And then Earl Edwards desegregated NC State. So as you can see from that, Duffy Daugherty's fingerprints are not just the 65, 66 seasons. They're coast to coast. They're throughout college football, changing the face of the game.
Yeah, and that's so much inspiration for you to write this book. And in your work, you mentioned how coverage of integration in college football by journalists was pretty much not there. Why do you think the significant stories of college football integration in the 60s in particular were overlooked by sports writers at that time?
Yeah, that's the reason Duffy's teams are misunderstood and not recognized, is because sports writers just didn't talk about race. They ignored it. They didn't want to alienate their readers or their advertisers. So Duffy's teams were setting these milestones throughout the 60s. A couple of examples of that. 1962, the Associated Press, in a rare example of the press reporting, wrote that the 17 black athletes at Michigan State was the most in major college football history. That same year, 1962, USC won the national title with 5 black players. Can you imagine a place as populous and diverse as Los Angeles, and they can only find 5 black players? So Duffy was way ahead of the game. And then in 1964, Michigan State was the first fully integrated team to play in the South when they went to North Carolina. And this is another milestone that was ignored. And it just goes on and on. The 1966 game of the century, Michigan State had 20 black players, 11 black starters, 2 black team captains, College Football Hall of Famers George Webster and Clinton Jones, and then Jimmy Ray is the South's first black quarterback to win a national title from segregated Fayetteville, North Carolina. On the other side of the field, Notre Dame, remember the unwritten quota, 1 black player. This wasn't written about. In fact, Dan Jenkins, who's the hero of anyone my age, grew up as a sports writer. He's the godfather of sports writers at Sports Illustrated. He covered the game. And his only reference to Jimmy Ray, the only black quarterback in college football, other than Gene Washington, who was at Stanford, but he got switched to wide receiver. The only reference that Dan Jenkins made to Jimmy Ray as the only black quarterback in college football is he had a thin mustache.
Wow. Wow. Only reference there. Now,
and that's Dan Jenkins.
And that, right, one of the great sports writers of all time. Now, the 60s, right? Obviously, that's the height of the civil rights movement. How did the civil rights movement influence the integration of college football during that time period?
Again, it was running a parallel track. Nobody was really writing about it. But at the same time, there were good people in the South that wanted to do the right thing. For example, Charlie Thornhill went to Michigan State out of segregated Roanoke, Virginia. And Charlie was on those 65 and 66 teams. There was a white sports writer in Roanoke, Virginia, at the Roanoke World Telegram, and he was opposed to segregation, and he had advocated for black athletes for a long time. And he finally got Charlie Thornhill as the first black player ever to make the all-area team. And the first school he called, because he knew Michigan State's reputation for black athletes dating to the 1954 and 56 Rose Bowls that were on TV, was Michigan State. And he talked to Vince Carolette, and Vince Carolette convinced Duffy Daugherty to take Charlie. Another black player from Michigan State, from North Carolina. He didn't turn out to be a star because he got hurt, but his story is a good example. He was at a black high school in Beaufort, North Carolina, and across town at the white high school, the coach knew that Ernie Pasteur had the potential to play in the Big Ten. He contacted Ernie's black coach and said, let me help you out and write some letters to some coaches in the Big Ten. And that's how he ended up at Michigan State. And at the same time, in 1964, Wake Forest decided to desegregate. Wake Forest does not get enough credit for being the first major conference school in the South to desegregate. They recruited Bob Grant out of Jacksonville, North Carolina, Butch Henry out of Greensboro, North Carolina. And they were the first, they recruited them out of high school. Now, Maryland gets credit for playing Darrell Hill as the first black athlete in 1963. But Darrell was a senior transfer. And then Maryland went 2, 3, 4 more years without really recruiting black players. Wake Forest was the first school to commit to it by recruiting black players out of high school. And Bob Grant went on to become the first black player from the major Southern Conference school drafted in the NFL when the Colts took him in the second round in 1968. So as Martin Luther King said, there were some white people doing the right thing. I think his quote was, when Bull Connor and all these terrible things were going on in Alabama, he said that the shame was of all the white people who know better, who do nothing and stay silent. Some white people were doing something.
Yeah, and they were trying to make a change there. Now, as I understand it, and you kind of spoke to this, how racism worked prevalently in college football is that there was an unwritten quota on the number of black players that colleges could recruit. What were some other challenges that early black college football players faced, and what led to the end of that unwritten quota?
Well, the Michigan State Notre Dame game was a tipping point. By then, the civil rights movement is moving along. Wake Forest is desegregated in 1964. Bill Yeoman, a Duffy Daugherty disciple, desegregates at Houston in 1964. Kentucky desegregates with 2 black recruits in 1966, 2 more in 1967. They were the first SEC school to desegregate 4 years before Bear Bryant, who unfairly gets all the credit. Um, Southern Methodist desegregated with Jerry Levias in 1965. Tennessee desegregated in 1967. So there were lots of schools. Someone like Bob Grant, Bob Grant originally planned to ride the Underground Railroad to Michigan State. He was committed, and Jimmy Ray was a friend of his. They were going to go up there together, but Bob Grant's high school coach convinced him to say, "Look, Wake Forest is trying to do something. They're trying to make changes. You can open doors for future black kids." So Bob Grant gave up on his dream to go play at Michigan State. Michigan State was a North Star for black kids in the South. And he gave up on his dream to go to Wake Forest and make history and help clear a road. And he did. He did not get enough credit for it, and he still does not get enough credit for it.
It sounds like there's a lot of people that haven't necessarily got the credit, right, they deserve around here. We're going to get into a bit of that now because in your book, you mentioned Southern black high school coaches as being integral to the integration of college football. Could you talk about them as well and who you view as the true pioneers when it came to integration in the sport?
Yeah, here's what happened is Michigan State had always had black players from Detroit, and Flint was a thriving factory auto town in the 50s and 60s, and with lots of athletes. So they'd always had black players. They didn't have them from the South at all. They were from Michigan factory towns. And so when Michigan State was on TV in the 1954 and 1956 Rose Bowl, which back then TV games were very rare, and the Rose Bowl was the biggest game of them all. And Southern black coaches, fans in general saw that Michigan State not only had black players, but they're all Americans scoring touchdowns. Leroy Bolden and Ellis Duckett. So this was already ingrained in the back of their minds if you're a black football coach or football fan in general in the South. So then in the late 50s, Hank Bulla, who was Duffy's longtime defensive coordinator, he told me this story before he passed away. He thought it was at a clinic in Atlanta in the late 50s, segregation in Atlanta, of course. And Duffy Doherty got there, and there was a lot of black high school coaches who wanted to hear him, but they wouldn't let him in. That upset Duffy Doherty. So he did his deal with the clinic, but he also arranged to put on a free clinic for all the black high school coaches. So now they already know Michigan State's reputation. And then you meet Duffy Doherty. Duffy Doherty there's no way not to like Duffy Doherty. So from then on, you had coaches calling Duffy saying, I've got a player for you. The first one was Clifton Rowe from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. His high school coach and principal contacted Duffy and asked him to take a look. And he was the first Underground Railroad passenger. That was one of the things I wanted to learn in my first book from research. Clifton Rowe got hurt and never really played. But interestingly, his son is Willie Rowe, the college and pro football Hall of Famer. So there were some football genes there, obviously. But the chief engineer of the Underground Railroad was Bubba Smith's father, because he was a legendary coach in Texas. He won 235 games, 2 black state titles during segregation. And his first son, Willie Ray Jr., went to Iowa. He had gotten hurt in high school, then he got hurt again at Iowa. And he was kind of isolated on the campus and didn't really have any support. So Willie Ray Sr. wanted a different experience for his second son, Bubba. And he contacted Duffy and asked him to take Bubba. And he said, while you're at it, there's this guy from across town, Washington Carver High School, who's been killing us, Baytown Carver, in football, basketball, and track. His name's Gene Washington. So Duffy took him, 2 college football Hall of Famers. And over time, Willie Ray Smith sent 9 players from the Houston area to Michigan State. And in fact, in that 1966 game of the century where I mentioned, Michigan State had 3 black starters from the Houston era: Bubba Smith, Gene Washington, College Football Hall of Fame, and Jess Phillips, who also went on to play in the NFL. So they had 3 black players from Houston, and Notre Dame only had 1 black player on their entire roster, Alan Page, and he wanted to go to Michigan State. But he had gone to a Catholic high school in Canton, Ohio. Canton's Catholic. And his parents wanted him to go to Notre Dame, so that's what he did.
Gotcha. Now, a couple more things real quick. Your book challenges some of the myths, as you mentioned, surrounding Alabama coach Paul Bear Bryant and his role in integration. Can you elaborate on these myths and the truths that you discovered in your research?
Yeah, yeah. Bear Bryant was a master manipulator of the media. Uh, he said in 1980, okay, the 1970 USC Alabama game is considered the tipping point to college football. That Alabama's fans were so shocked by Sam Cunningham running over their team that they said, "Okay, Bear Bryant, it's okay. You can recruit black athletes now." Well, there's several problems with that myth. And the other part of that myth is that Bear Bryant had a secret plan to schedule USC as a game to lose because he wanted to shock his fans. Well, first of all, Bear Bryant had already recruited Wilbur Jackson as his first black athlete in 1970, and he had tried in 1968 and 69, but failed. Uh, James James Owens was the first black player at Auburn in 1969. So there was nothing stopping an Alabama college coach from signing a black athlete. And when James Owens was signed in 1969, Shug Jordan, the head coach, he didn't get fired. That's what Bear Bryant's sycophants always say. Bear Bryant couldn't sign a black player because he'd get fired by George Wallace. Um, so Bear Bryant already had a black player. There was no shock to USC overrunning Alabama because in 1969, 1 year earlier, same place, Legion Field, Birmingham, Tennessee, which was its third year as an integrated program, they went down to Legion Field, and Tennessee's Jackie Walker, the first black All-American linebacker in the SEC, he intercepted a pass and returned it for a touchdown for a 21-0 lead in the first quarter. Tennessee led 34-0 in the second half before Alabama scored. Final score 41-14. That wasn't enough of a shock. And so it's a myth that was made up 20 years after the game was played out in Los Angeles by USC, trying to bolster their own I don't even say dubious, their poor record on integration because they followed the quota. But they were trying to dress up their school and their reputation, but they really have a poor one. And the myth caught on, and Alabama fans obviously embraced it. One more point I failed to make. They talk about Bear Bryant breaking ground with that 1970 game. By 1970, Alabama was the 7th of 10 Southeastern Conference schools to recruit their first black player, and 33 of the 37 major Southern programs had black players. And on that same night, let me get in one more point. On that same night that nobody ever writes about, everybody ignores this. On that same night that USC routed Alabama, Stanford played at Arkansas, War Memorial Stadium in Fayetteville. It was the national game of the week by ABC. Dan Jenkins was there to cover it. And Stanford beat Arkansas, the number 4 ranked team in the country, playing for a national title. And Stanford beat him. And guess who the star of the game was? A black fullback named Hillary Shockley. He had 149 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Nobody knows these stories. But at Stanford, on this team, Hillary Shockley told me, and I've written about this, he says, when we have our reunions from our Rose Bowl teams, because Stanford went on and won the Pac-8 that same year. And that 1970 USC team, they didn't even make a bowl game. And Stanford won the Pac-8 and then upset Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. And Hillary Shockley says the Stanford guys say, how come USC gets all the credit? We were the more important team from the 1970 season. But my main point is by 1970, all the sacrifices from Southern black pioneers in the South, like Jerry Levias, the leadership from Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty, hadn't made college football fait accompli. by 1970. It was no big deal for an integrated team to play in the South. But that's the myth that USC and Bear Bryant and Alabama sycophants have gotten away with.
Gotcha on that. Last thing for me, Tom, what do you hope readers take away from your book about the broader implications of these pioneers' efforts on today's sports culture?
True pioneers of college football are Michigan State's teams from the 1960s, Bob Grant at Wake Forest. Jerry Levias played through death threats when he played for Southern Methodist in the Southwest Conference as the first black scholarship player. When they played at Texas, the fans waved nooses at him. They thought it was funny. When they played at TCU, the FBI deemed a death threat as credible. So much so they escorted him to and from the locker room, and they were scanning the stadium for a sniper. In my book, The Right Thing to Do, Jerry sent me a photo of him being escorted by the FBI agents, and I used it in the book. It was a photo that he got from a fan years later. He had never seen it. So this has never been published anywhere. But anyways, Jerry, don't tell me that Sam Cunningham opened the eyes and changed the hearts in one single night, which never happens in American race relations. It's always a long process. And the true pioneer, I hope from anyone who reads this book realizes that who the true pioneers are, and that they have not gotten their proper credit. It's an injustice to them.
Yeah, I hope that people can take that away from that book. The book is a fantastic one by Tom Shanahan. It's titled The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration. Definitely check that one out. Tom, I appreciate the time and the discussion and you setting the record straight and letting people know about a great piece of history surrounding college football and the true pioneers around it. Appreciate you so much, sir, and hopefully we'll talk to you down the road. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hopefully we reached a wider audience.
Hope so. Thank you, sir.